It's great to have everybody here again on such a beautiful evening and on a subject like Like Artaud. So it fits, I think, with the madness of spring, and as we probably all felt today, kind of something in the air in terms of nature, which it gets to this quality of Artaud living between thought and gesture, and holding a place between thought and gesture. Sylvère is quite a significant figure in terms of being a literary critic and cultural theorist, as well as a quite legendary teacher of many, many people. And also the founder of the independent press Semiotext, which, as many of you are probably familiar with, was instrumental in bringing many very important, I don't think we would say the word apparatus with as much conviction as we do without Sylvère. So from Baudelaire to Debord to Deleuze to Foucault, but also to Lucy Irigaray, Chris Kraus, Kristeva, Sueli Rolnick, and Kathy Acker. Semiotext has been just a very important publisher over the last 35 plus years. So it's really an honor to have Sylvère here to talk about his new book that is out through Univocal Publishing, Like Artaud, but also a new film of which we will see part of an excerpt from the film called The Man Who Disappeared, also brand new and engaged with Sylvère's long kind of thinking through Artaud and thinking through Artaud's work, Artaud's life, Artaud's influence, Artaud's myth, and in a sense, as he put it, Artaud as a resonance. And I think that's a really nice way to think about the book and the film as a resonance. And perhaps that maybe will come up in the reading and in the conversation later. So the one thing I just wanted to, it made me think in reading the book, which is literally just, the first 100 copies just came in the last 2 days, so they're available as you exit, and if you haven't picked it up, I recommend it, from Univocal, Like Artaud. But in having read the book prior to this evening, it's has a lot of intensity, a lot of velocity, and a lot of difficulty to some degree, I would say. But it made me think of a quote, but also a quote from the poet Osip Mandelstam. And in part, I bring this up because it was a quote that came up in relationship to Primo Levi, who you may have heard of, who was a survivor of Auschwitz and also wrote very important books like Survival in Auschwitz or the Periodic Table. And Levi is a very observant, very rational writer, an incredible writer, and he, in some ways, had at the same time a weakness, as he put it, for the two left hands of poetry, as he put it, that poetry has two left hands, that it could act against the rational. And I think that troubled him. It troubled him in his life, and it troubled in his life after Auschwitz. And he actually very much took up a kind of the one time he ever entered into a public squabble was around his opinion of the work of Paul Celan and George Trakl, two poets. And I bring this up because Mandelstam, a Russian poet who also, to some degree, died in a death camp of sorts, wrote a very interesting thing about the difference between prose and poetry. And I know Artaud is not necessarily a poet, but I think it's relevant. So I'm just going to read this and then hand it over to Sylvère. And Mandelstam writes in an essay called On the Defense of Poetry, he says, "Fear of a concrete addressee, of an audience of our age, of a friend in this generation, has doggedly pursued poets of all ages. And the greater the poet's talent, the more acutely he has suffered this fear. Hence the notorious hostility between the artist and society. What may be meaningful to the prose writer or essayist, the poet finds absolutely meaningless. The difference between prose and poetry may be defined as follows. The prose writer always addresses himself to a concrete audience, to the dynamic representatives of his age. Even when making prophecies, he bears his future contemporaries in mind. His subject matter brims over into the present, in keeping with the physical law of unequal levels. Consequently, the prose writer is compelled to a, quote, higher than, to be, quote, superior to society. Since instruction is the central nerve of prose, the prose writer requires a pedestal. Poetry is another matter. The poet is bound only to his addressee. He is not compelled to tower over his age, to appear superior to society. Indeed, François Villon stood below the median moral and intellectual level even of the 15th century. So I'm going to welcome up Sylvère Lotringer to the stage.
Well, thank you, Finn. What can I say afterwards? I think I'll pick up what you said about resonance, because it's, of course, the relation of writer to his or her time is not mechanical, and you can't just infer one from the other. But there's definitely something happening between the two world wars. You know, don't remember Virginia Woolf getting mad during the First World War and then committing suicide the Second World War. Think of Artaud spending the First World War not in an asylum but in a clinic, and the Second War in an asylum. Something happened between the two wars, you know. And recently, our attention has been attracted to the First World War because it was something of a blank for most people until this celebration. But celebration are you know what they are worth, which is meant to be forgotten. Don't forget that the First World War was the first huge Holocaust or destruction. Right, something like 20 million people from one day to the next or 1 year to the next got killed. You know, it was not a very simple event. It was the killing fields of the Western world. It didn't involve only the Western world, but basically it marks something like it was a deadline, a leap forward into the unknown that we are still exploring and still indebted to. It was a leap, the first leap of technology. As you know, the First World War started like everyone was very excited to go to the battle and on a horse. And 2 years later, you had the introduction of these machines that are to be invented quickly and put in some sort of operation in order to break down the stalemate between the enemies on the field. So during the First World War, not afterwards, but during the First World War, there was a leap from some sort of rural, pre-industrial, not pre-industrial, but industrial society to a full-fledged madness of modernity, right? And Artaud was very young at the time, but he's part of what we call the high modernists, you know, at least in French literature. These people who were squeezed between the two wars, who had the shadow of the First War, and already anticipating the Second. And that's really why I personally got interested in Artaud, Georges Bataille, Simone Weil, a number of these very strange, maddening or mad people who, in some way, were the yellow canaries of our time. even though they were not exactly focused on it, everything they did was as if they were entering in resonance with some sort of a death instinct that Freud, revealed in 1922. And you find that also in Céline, another one, a bit more controversial writer of the time, who came back from Vienna and who heard about the death instinct in 1922 when he came back. And he gave a famous lecture in Meudon where he said, it's beautifully written, but he said that now Europe was made of these countries that were rushing against each other in some sort of a desire of mutual extermination, right? And he was condemning it and condemning this kind of delirium that was infecting the entire social landscape in Europe. And what happened is that 3 years later, Artaud, Céline, who was speaking against the war, suddenly got touched by it. Like Artaud, when he writes The Theatre and the Plague, he doesn't say that the plague needs to be incubated directly, but the plague is something that permeates a culture at a certain time, so that people at a distance, people who have nothing to do with it, suddenly get infected or not. And either they get cured or they survive, right? Or they die. So Céline, 3 years later, turned anti-Semitic. Right? He caught the plague, the brown plague, right? And Artaud wrote this book, this essay on the plague, the Theatre on the Plague, in 1933. Right, exactly as Hitler was coming to power. Same way, Bataille was writing his notion of expenditure, exactly at the same time in 1933. It doesn't matter that they are the exact date, but something resonated. And of course, if you think of Europe at a place where in the late 20s already fascism was on its way, fascism was this kind of a plague that could communicate at a distance. You don't need to touch it to get incubated. And Céline was the first casualty of it. He became this kind of rabid racist and anti-Semitic, which he was not at the beginning. Right? So something happened to Europe. And this something that happened to Europe interests us because we are seeing the aftermath of it. Not just of the war, but first of the technological leap. Right? Artaud, in his introduction to his complete works, talks about some sort of rupture between words and things, between reason and unreason. There's something that happened that made the relation to people very different from what it was before. Right. So there is technology, but what is the effect of technology? The fact that basically the relationship to the ground, the soil, the kind of peasant culture that existed before the First World War was ruptured. We've accelerated into not just the technology, but the war technology. Right? And technology from then on became war. War in time of peace as war in time of war, right? And the whole entire society was kind of raised to a certain level of insensitivity, right? In other words, as if the culture had been shell-shocked, and not just during the First World War on the field, but shell-shocked so that you could say that the casualty of the First World War was exactly that. The casualty was the lack of affects, as if everyone had a hard time to communicate with the emotion that permeated them, right? And with Deleuze says affects, emotion always come from the outside, right? They come from the outside, but they're very powerful. And Artaud's delirium is of that kind. Artaud's delirium, maybe he experienced it as as a lonely event to his life. But first of all, he was always delirious to start with, right? And he had a special resonance to it. You know that Artaud, when Artaud arrived in Paris in 1922 from Marseille, he was in some sort of pre-psychotic state. You know, as you can read when in his correspondence with Jacques Rivière, right? So it was 1923, right? He arrives in Paris to be an actor, and then he sends a few poems to Jacques Rivière, was the editor of Gallimard, and the editor is very polite, and he sends him a letter back, and he said, you know, your poems are really imperfect, right? So I can't really publish them, but I'm interested in your mind, right? And that was the beginning of a very amazing correspondence between the very humanistic and very intelligent editor and Artaud. And Artaud was like the young poet who wants to be published, and if the editor closes the door in one hand, then he opens another one, so that in some way he corners the editor into publishing, if not his imperfect poem, at least the perfect exchange of letters that they had, right? But what Artaud was saying in that correspondence, he said, look, I think, but what I think, I'm not sure that it belongs to me. Right? It's as if someone or something was taking away my thought before I have time to claim them. You know? It's as if someone was robbing me of my thoughts. And I'm not sure that it is me who's thinking. And he spent pages describing his mind down to the last neuron, so that to make sure that the connection is being established in his head and not outside, right? So this is, is somewhere a symptom that could have got a bit more grave if Artaud hadn't been invited to participate in the surrealist group by Breton. And in a way, his pre-madness, if we want to call it that way, was socialized. He became, as soon as he entered the surrealist group, he was so full of this kind of mad energy that Aragon proclaimed him the Führer, the dictator of the surrealists. And to the point also that Breton quickly realized that he had introduced the devil and got rid of Artaud, right? And so the good excuse that Artaud, after that, and about the same time, renounced the group because the group has sided with the budding Communist Party. And Artaud wrote them a manifesto saying, look, you're talking about revolution, social revolution. I wish I had only that to suffer from. He said, I suffer from something metaphysical, a revolution that would encompass the whole of a human race, right? And then, a few years later, he goes to, in 1936, he goes to Ireland, as you will see in the film. But Ireland, not at any single time. Ireland was in the throes of a Marxist revolution, right? And Artaud came with his idea of a pantheism and his idea of a revolution for the red blood of the Indians, right? And as usual, Artaud always falls into a place where he doesn't belong, but always managed to get something out of it. Of the worst error, it turns into some sort of experience that contributes to his art. Now, yes. So the change, if you want. The change was going from some sort of grounded culture, to some sort of, where people related in some sort of a symbolic fashion, right? I mean, if you want to buy a field, you go to the owner and you buy the field and you shake hands. The shaking hand is a symbolic act, It is something that you don't need to have any papers, right? It's something that people are going to hold the same way when people's name is defamed when you provoke someone in a duel, because your name is really you and it's all your genealogy, and you don't want it to be dirtied by someone's insult, right? So we were passing from, we're basically transiting from a time where technology hadn't taken over, but where everyone was connected to the ground in which they lived. People were in villages, people lived around the church, etc., etc. All this is abruptly changing, right? So that people are going to be deterritorialized, as Deleuze would say, literally, because all the peasants who can have hard times surviving in a country moved to the cities and got enlisted to the factories. They became workers. So peasants became workers, and then if you look at it from our point of view now, and workers didn't stay in the factories after the Second World War, but slowly were eased out into another position, which is to be consumers. The work in our society now is that our work is to consume, right? So production is not very important, but it is consumption that became the product, right? Commodities are becoming us. Our names, Facebook, etc., etc. We are not very far from that. It's only, not quite a century ago that the capitalist machine started changing these kind of symbolic values into some exchange values, right? And exchange values is a movement of capital. It's what Guattari called the flows of capital, right? So now we don't live in a symbolic world. We live in a semio world, a semiosphere, right? Where everything is circulating and nothing really holds. And that's what the idea of exchangeability. If you shake someone's hand, it doesn't mean anything. If you give your word, it doesn't mean anything, because capitalism is a very cynical system, as you noticed, and doesn't know anything about morality. There is no morality to capitalism. There is no antecedent. So we now all some sort of artists in consumption, and we resonate with the era in which we live. And for the last 15 or 20 years, something as momentous as what happened after the First World War is happening to us. We are now the guinea pig of a huge enterprise where we are like anonymous, and exchangeable participants. Right? Artaud was fighting against that. He was fighting against this rupture between words and thing. He wanted, he was opposed to theory, right? And it may be strange for me to say that I've been opposed to theory of my life, right? Because I expected theory to change something. Right? I didn't want a theory to be something you put on your label or something that means that you belong to a club. But when I came to this country, I thought that there was an incredible resonance between the newest French theories and the way people were living in New York. I'm not saying in the whole country, but in New York, which was a city totally dilapidated at the time, but very experimental. It was not just the works and art. People were living very experimental days, and they didn't have a choice. Right? So what I've been trying to do is introduce theory, because I thought that the French hadn't done much in terms of art since Yves Klein died in 1963 and the Nouveau Realiste collapsed, but that somehow the French theory was French art. Right? And it was, and up to now, it has been the most important contribution to thinking. To thinking what? Not thinking the history of philosophy, but thinking our time, right? What I was interested in, like Artaud, and not to make any comparison, is something very concrete. If you experience a theory, then you can do something with the theory. But if you let theory float on the surface, then it is like an exchange value. It's taken over by other signs, right? So it was very important for me, especially since I came to the States, to hang on to Artaud, because Artaud is someone who is totally disaffected, contrary to what it seems, and that took me time to realize. I always thought Artaud, we think Artaud was for shock, for violence, but why is he so violent? Is so violent because he can't feel anything? As G.J. Ballard said, the casualty of the 20th century is the affects. We killed our affects. And Artaud is not someone who just accepted it, but he was totally panicked by the fact that he couldn't feel anything. He didn't know who he was. He constantly had to find if what he was doing was really his own, right, as I explained before. So once you understand that this theatrical cruelty is not only a Jarry bet on Artaud's part, but it is really a necessity. What his psychosis was is that he couldn't feel anything, right? He was totally disconnected from the rest of society and from the rest of the world and the cosmos. And his delirium was just a way of trying to reconnect. And that's what I'm trying to show in the film that you're going to see. Artaud became mad systematically. He had a plan. And the plan, he had written it down. And while he was going to Ireland, his book was just about to come out. It's called The Theatre and the Plague. And the book, written exactly at the same time over the last few years than his trip to Ireland, in fact, confirmed what Artaud has always said, that art and life is just one and the same thing. What he was experiencing was theory, if you want, right? But he was experiencing theory in the wrong way, because theory is what prevented him to exist, right? In other words, his mental state was something he could explore, but he could never master it as long as he had no body, no concrete access to the world, right? And this aspect, again, is something that begins to be implemented between the two world wars, and that made people between the two world wars, some people were more receptive to the flows that were circulating. So, well, many people couldn't care less. They felt it in their body, in their mind. They felt that they were all psychotic, and that maybe they were incubated by a sickness that it was their duty to explore. They were some sort of a guinea pig, the yellow canaries of things that were even worse than they experienced, the culture had experienced before. And that's why it's a two-way thing, you know. They came out of the First War, and which resonates in their life, but they were also resonating to shadows that were accumulating, clouds that were accumulating, and that they were convinced were going to end up with some sort of apocalypse, right? So that's, of course, the other element of Artaud, is that Artaud is a very religious person. I wrote this book to deny a little bit the interest of the quarrel that happened episodically to France, whether Artaud was a Christian or not, right? And it seemed to be like a very, very kind of moot point, because who wants to judge God? If not someone who believes in God, right? In other words, what Artaud was trying to do, like Bataille, like Simone Weil, all these high modernists, they were trying to find some source of energy that would come to rebuild the decline of the religion in Europe. Let me reformulate that. Artaud was very aware of the fact, like all of them, that they were going from a time where things had a necessity, things were connecting to everything, to the cosmos, to an era where religion were failing, and there was nothing to replace them, except what they kind of witnessed at the time, which is a rise of fanaticism. So in order to be able to explore this very mad situation of Europe that Europe was going through, they had to inoculate some of it, or at least to resonate to this fanaticism. They became fanatics themselves, fanatics of death, in a very different way than the Nazis, of course. But in some way, they couldn't have understood what this fanaticism was about if they didn't have a foot in it. If they were not exposed to it, if it was not part of their own makeup, mental makeup or physical makeup. So again, what interested me in these people and in Artaud is the fact that they anticipate in a very concrete way the huge death-like landscape that was opening up under their feet, right? And Artaud, in that respect, is not just a mad person who wrote during the two World War, but before the Second World War, he was already talking about us. If you read The Judgment of God, it's amazing. If you haven't read it or listened to it, read it now. What does it say? It says very strange things. There's a people who I thought were very pacific, called Americans, and now they're all crazy for guns. I said, what is American culture about? War machines, a machine. And a machine comes first and the soldiers come behind, So, of course, he said between America and Russia, Stalin's Russia, they were in cahoot precisely to precipitate the situation, right? And that was 1947. Artaud already was there. He understood exactly that the war, once you start it, will never finish. And that's why I think Artaud is also very important, because the various spiral of passage from industrialism to post-industrialism to the financialization of the economy. It's a degree, a spiral on more and more abstraction. And abstraction was exactly what Artaud was trying to fight. And that's why everything about Artaud, down to his language, is very concrete, very, very pragmatic, very, he constantly wants to give himself a body, right? But for fear of that, he gave himself a body without organ, which is an attempt to create a body that would be immaculate, that could be pure of any sort of the invasion of signs, right? And that's what we're going to see in the last sequence of the film, which is in fact about 12 minutes long of Artaud's vision of the body without organ, of the pure body. Now, the sequence I'm going to show is about 20 minutes long, about 1/3 of the film. And we finished it last week, and we're going to show it around. This is the first time anything of it has permeated publicly. So I hope you like it.
Antonin Artaud never had much of a career as an actor. He was far too extreme and demonic to fit in anywhere. He gave up on the cinema when the talkies took over. Then he turned to the stage. But the only play he managed to produce the Cenci, in 1936, ended in disaster. This was the end of his career in the theatre. 40, penniless, a lifelong junkie, he decided to leave for Mexico on a mythical journey, hoping to find his theatre of cruelty in life.
Les Mexicains font un effort particulier pour ne pas se penser eux-mêmes comme des humains, afin de pouvoir communiquer avec l'ensemble de la création.
Artaud's trip to Mexico was a huge error. He had broken up with André Breton and the Surrealists after they joined the Communist Party. But Mexico was in the throes of a Marxist revolution. They had no time for pagan rituals and his pantheistic views. So his return to Paris was a catastrophe. He had no money, a lifelong junkie. His demon forced him to leave.
I love you and life is wonderful.
You love me and life is wonderful.
I love you and life is beautiful. I love you. Come here where I can see you.
There.
I am tall. I am clear. I am dense.
We love each other.
We are intense. Oh, what a well-made world. Helen has gone mad. Let's get out of here. I've lost her. Give her back. Who? My wife.
Your wife? He's joking.
She could be yours.
It may be true. What part of your body do you most want?
God. Damn her!
The Virgin. That's who he was looking for.
Les anciens druides savaient qu'une seule énergie passait de l'homme à l'animal et aux plantes, et que les pierres même surgissaient de la terre. Pour faire la croix, les druides se mettent au centre d'une espèce de vide, et la croix pousse autour d'eux.
Little is known about Artaud's stay on Inishmore, an Aran island famous for its spectacular barrenness. All we have are the letters he wrote his astrologist. He was hoping to receive an advance from his publisher, and he walked 2 hours every day to the post office, hoping to receive an advance on his forthcoming The Theatre and Its Double. But the money never materialized. He was broke, he was alone, and he spoke no English. Was this the face of his own death? 13 years ago, when he arrived from Paris, he felt that something was destroying his thought. Something furtive, which robbed him of the words that he'd found. And he wondered whether suicide was a solution. But no, suicide is still a hypothesis. And he demanded the right to doubt suicide, as he doubted all of reality. All he knew was that he suffered atrociously from life.
C'est un vrai fou qui vous parle. Je ne suis pas mort, mais je suis séparé. Je sais ce que j'ai vu et ce que je crois, et qui dira que je n'ai pas vu ce que j'ai vu. Je lui déchire maintenant la tête. Voilà longtemps que j'ai senti le vide, mais que j'ai refusé de me jeter dans le vide. J'ai été lâche, comme tout ce que je vois. Quand j'ai cru que je refusais le monde, je sais maintenant que je refusais le vide qui était déjà en moi. Car je suis une irrémissible brute. Je prévois une destruction par le feu, et cette destruction sera radicale. Un seul homme va la diriger, et cet homme est un torturé. Qu'est-ce que cela veut dire ? Cela veut dire que brûler est une action magique et qu'il faut consentir à brûler d'avance pour ne pas s'exposer à brûler tout entier. Le torturé est devenu pour tout le monde la révélée. Dis-leur que voilà des années que je les hais, eux et leurs idées politiques, sociales, morales, amorales et immorales. Dis-leur que je les prends pour des crapules et pour des cons. Dis-leur que je chie sur la République, la démocratie, le socialisme, le communisme, le marxisme, l'idéalisme, le matérialisme, dialectique ou non. Je chie sur le Front populaire, je chie sur l'International, première, deuxième et troisième, mais je chie aussi sur l'idée de patrie. Je chie sur la France et sur tous les Français, sauf ceux que j'ai personnellement avertis d'Irlande. Les Français, qu'ils se croient de droite ou de gauche, sont tous des cons et des propriétaires. J'en ai éperdument assez. Ils ne sont pas assez fous. Ils ne se jettent pas assez à la gorge les uns des autres. Et plus ils sont furieux, plus ils sont enragés, mieux ils sont. L'écriture est de la cochonnerie.
Before he left Paris for Ireland, Artaud had a violent quarrel with Lise de Arme. A minor surrealist poet, André Breton had hopelessly courted at the time he was writing Nadia. De Arme eventually married a rich banker and tried to raise some money for Artaud's play, The Cenci. But his intolerance made it impossible. In the company of Jacqueline Breton, De Arme ridiculed Artaud's pantheism and called him a ham actor, which infuriated him no end.
Cher André Breton, une femme que vous connaissez qui se prend pour une révolutionnaire va fomenter une horrible émeute avec toutes les forces de gauche coalisées et étrangement alliées au haut capitalisme juif et peut-être même catholique. L'émeute sera pulvérisée avec la plus implacable rigueur. Cette femme devra fuir sous peine d'être publiquement massacrée. C'est LD. Elle fulmine en ce moment à cause de ce que je lui ai écrit et voudrait faire croire aux autres et se persuader à elle-même que je ne suis qu'un cabotin ou un charlatan. Madame Lise de Arme porte la peine d'avoir dit qu'il n'y a pas plusieurs dieux, mais un seul, de là ma haine. C'est le paganisme qui a eu raison. Elle a menacé de me faire brûler comme un sorcier. J'ai brûlé toute ma vie avec la force de tous les feux. Mais si je brûle, j'acquiers aussi le pouvoir de brûler. et une colère dévastatrice monte maintenant en moi. Peu de colères peuvent atteindre où ma colère pourra monter. Entre la colère d'un esprit furieux et la force dévastatrice de tous les feux, il n'y a en réalité pas de distance. Je ferai enfoncer une croix de fer rougie au feu dans ton sexe, puant de juive, et cabotinerai ensuite sur ton cadavre pour te prouver qu'il y a encore des dieux. Anne Manson, va-t'en aux deux magots, femme, trahis-moi. Révèle-leur que je suis à Dublin et qu'ils viennent donc me prendre. Mais avertis-les de ce qui leur pend au nez, car ce sera implacable et sans merci. Ils voudront probablement m'arrêter à Paris, mais ça ne durera pas longtemps. Et si Madame de Harme a l'idée de venir me chercher en Irlande, elle ferait mieux de s'éviter le voyage. Elle ne me trouvera pas. En revanche, moi, je la retrouverai lorsque l'heure en sera venue et qu'elle ne triomphe pas trop vite. Si elle est encore vivante le 1er janvier 1938.
It was me, along with playwright Arthur Adamov, who succeeded in getting Antonin Artaud released from the asylum at Rodez, in the south of France, where he had been subjected to 52 electroshocks. I wept on the train that was taking us back to Paris, which had just been liberated. He looked like he had just returned from a concentration camp.
So we'll continue the madness a little bit more. You can stand it. My name's Drew Burke. I'm one of the editors for this volume by Sylvère Lotringer, and I have next to me Joanna Spinks, the translator. And we're going to perform and do a little reading from the text. I'll be playing the part of one of Artaud's psychiatrists at Rodez, Dr. Jacques Latremolière, and Joanna will play the part of Sylvère Lotringer.
When you read Artaud's texts, do you ever try to forget about the man you knew? To read them as you would read Racine?
Oh, no. He speaks to me. He speaks to me anyway. He doesn't say much, but he does speak to me. Yes.
And what does he say?
Just images. He tosses images around. It doesn't mean anything. In 30 or 50 years, I'm sure no one will speak of him.
How did you first hear about Artaud?
I didn't hear about him. He arrived under our care at Rodez because he had been starving at Villevraud. Dr. Ferrier knew one of the psychiatrists there who had the option to lock him up. When we received him, he looked so wretched and thin. I hadn't read anything by him at that point. And if I hadn't met him, I never would have, that's for sure.
So you knew nothing about Artaud when you saw him for the first time. How was he presented to you?
Dr. Ferrier informed me. He told me he was coming straight from Ireland, that they'd arrested him for causing chaos on the boat. He was talking about St. Patrick's stick when they locked him up in the nearest psychiatric hospital, Sotteville-les-Rins, if I remember correctly. And they knew right away what they were dealing with. No one claimed he was normal. You just had to spend a half an hour with him.
I know quite a few people who aren't totally normal, as you say, or ordinary. I always learn interesting things from them. They take shortcuts.
If you view them from the outside, yeah.
And you view them from the inside?
I had to. All psychiatrists are obliged to follow their patients, to speak with them as equals. But the fact that I had complete power over his freedom worked against me. Though I wasn't the only one. It didn't make our friendship easy. But because he needed me, he was always charming. Charming. In casual conversation, he never spoke the way he did later. Later, anything was possible for him. Everyone hung on his every word. There are always people ready to proclaim a miracle as soon as they see something unusual. But if you really look at his text, especially the later ones, take Van Gogh. There are 3 correct pages in there. The rest is a joke.
But isn't it strange that even isolated from the great cataclysm all around him, isolated as Van Gogh was, a man who was evidently not normal—
Thank you.
—finds a way to express—
Not quite normal.
—finds a way to express all the horror and all the madness of the world.
You draw curious parallels.
The point isn't to know whether Artaud deceived his friends. I'm sure he did, especially those friends upon whom his freedom depended. It's the least he could do.
That doesn't make it okay. It doesn't contribute to the betterment of society.
No.
Thank you, thank you.
Maybe those who surrounded him and those he depended upon shouldn't have allowed that kind of relationship. But his writing expresses intuitions not only about what's going on in his head, but his head becomes the world.
No, come on, listen. I seriously pity you because you really need some tranquilizers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for sure.
After all, why does literature even exist? Why do people rack their brains to say things indirectly?
Because they hope to make money. How many people write for the glory of getting on television?
In Artaud's time, there was radio.
The situation's still the same.
Why do we teach these things in schools if people write only to make money, or because they're a bit bizarre?
What people? Artaud is hardly taught in schools.
I teach him at Columbia University, and I'm not the only one.
Yeah, well, I pity your students. Oh yes, because they're not happy in life. This type of thing won't make them stronger. On the contrary, it will leave them crawling around in the dark.
So you find that Artaud's texts don't have any power?
No, I said they wouldn't make people stronger.
If they're powerful, they must generate power.
But it's obviously a grotesque power. I've seen him cry out. Didn't hold any ground. He revealed himself. He alone mattered, nothing else. So don't tell me he was sensitive to civilization. He was sensitive to his own brutal pain. I do acknowledge that, and I investigated his pain with him. But hey, his pain, it was his alone. So don't put it on a pedestal.
That also happened to Christ.
Thank you. First of all, it was Artaud himself who identified with Christ.
Of course.
There's still a slight difference.
I wasn't trying to make a literal comparison.
You've just done it. You've just done it.
And why not? In both cases, there's perhaps something of interest for the world.
In both cases? In the first, yes. I talked about God with Antonin Artaud, so I know perfectly well what he thought. As far as I know, Christ never vulgarly insulted entire populations. No, I won't take you back to Sunday school.
Regarding all this controversy about whether Artaud believed in God or not, what do you think?
Nothing at all, because it's of no importance. He believed at one time, and afterwards, he no longer did. When he believed wrongly or strangely. So if you can synthesize something from all this, you're a lucky one.
Continue the conversation a little bit. I'm going to ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to the audience off script. So is that okay? Does it sound okay? Yeah. So I think maybe just a few things, because the book just came out and I'm sure everyone will have an opportunity to read it, but haven't yet, is even in the clip from the film, there's some, the book kind of goes between dialogues that you had and also your kind of more essayistic observations about Artaud and about the context, including pretty important things even in the clip from the Man Who Disappeared, around the fact that Artaud indeed, for instance, was Jewish and didn't really know that he was Jewish until he was 18 years old, and had a very violent, in a sense, response to that, but also clearly a deeply contradictory relationship to religion, and religion at a time, as you've put it, or as Rilke put it as well, when God had withdrawn, or when God was viewed or at least discussed as being dead. And clearly Artaud is someone who seems to have been buffeted by that in a very particular way. But I think just because of the difference between, say, Céline's anti-Semitism and Artaud's kind of self-anguish about being Jewish, but not, in a sense, being Jewish. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's important to...
There's many things you said.
Yeah.
I have to unpack it a little bit. First of all, Artaud's relation to religion, I haven't really been very specific about it, but since God was retreating, precisely at that time, all of these people went back to the pagan religions in order to buff up the Christian religion that was failing and that was incapable of maintaining this kind of a symbolic order that it contributed to create, right? So that's why they resorted to the notion of sacrifice, with the bataille, ritual sacrifice, where you kill someone ritually, right? Or Artaud, theater of cruelty. They all believed that in some way, since everything was falling apart, they could experiment like in a little laboratory. They could experiment on these affects that were circulating, that hit them from the outside, but were hitting all these people outside who were carried away by these murderous, impulses. So they tried to set up places where they would be able to examine the virus, the social virus that was permeating in the culture. And that's really what I think Bataille, Artaud, Simone Weil, they all went back to the Greek and the before, trying to isolate something that would really strengthen religion, even if it were not a Christian religion, because they all rejected it. But they rejected it before because they all wanted to be priests in some way. They deeply cared for religion, but the religion that was left in their hand was too bloodless to do the job for society, and would let these hordes that were ready to kill each other totally at their own obedience, right? So I saw that as some sort of an emergency situation, which they responded with the means that were at hand, the theater, the philosophy. They were all trying, or becoming an activist like Simone Weil. They were all trying to become fanatics themselves, fanatics without a religion to boot, right? But amalgamating everything that could be compacted into something that would be the wall that would stop, the murderous impulses that were coming to the front. Right? So that's one point. The second point, what was it? What?
The Judaism and his being Jewish.
Oh yes. Okay. So I have to reveal something. Is that and the French didn't quite understand that. Artaud, it's a bit like a Jarry answer to the question. The question was that the French are still debating whether Artaud was Christian or not. It was a very stupid quarrel. No one who is not a Christian could have responded to God, the way he did. Right? So, in order to eliminate the question was badly held, right? So I decided that I would turn Artaud into a Jew, right? Because of course he was a Hindu Jew, he was a Marrano. Right? He came from a family that were all the more deeply religious that they were trying to hide the fact that they were Jewish. So I rewrote his biography so that the question becomes totally ridiculous, you see. But at the same time, there is no way of telling from the book. I never quite reveal what it is. But why not? That he came from a Lebanese, from a Turkish, Oriental family. They were extremely religious. There was a huge crucifix in his room. He'd been dragged from one pilgrimage to another one in order to the family was hoping to get him cured. His whole atmosphere, his whole environment, especially his mother, his sisters, etc., were all in pushing him towards religion. And at 18, like Bataille, at 18 they just took the Catholicism down and they looked for something else, right? And that's part of this kind of common enterprise between these kind of solitary geniuses, if you want. It's a bad word because we don't have geniuses anymore. We don't want them because we don't want to realize that it has become impossible because geniuses don't grow in any garden. It takes a whole culture to produce minds like that, and minds who are not just talking about something but putting their life on the line. What I call, these high modernists is people who are not just talking about something or warning about something. They could only put it by putting their life, their sanity in question. It is true for Bataille and Artaud and Simone Weil and a few others. That's why they are so important, because they were the awareness of culture at the time. They were the one who anticipated what was going to come, and they were right. We still Artaudian, but we don't know yet. I don't know about being Jewish, of course.
So, I mean, you think of, I mean, this also gets to one of the still kind of recurrent myths around the artist as being too close to creativity to be sane, or to always be on the verge of it. But one of the things that I think you said, which is very true of the time, but in Artaud's case maybe is redoubled, is that you're describing in kind of like a anesthesia of sorts that happens from World War I, which many people, 20 million, or beyond 20 million people, killed in a wholly entirely new way at the hands of technology that was impersonalized, and clearly that created beyond a kind of a ripple, one could say a complete dismantling of psychology or any sort of coherent psychology, especially in Europe. And this is what Benjamin called the vulnerability of, in a sense, a daze that overtook everyone in between the wars. And this is also when you talk about, from Kafka to Robert Walser to Artaud, writers who actually wind up in a sanatorium of some sort. But also, you could say the same about, I don't know how many times Gertrude Stein was called mad, or Virginia Woolf was also called mad. But in the case of Artaud, there is a performance of being mad in the work, in the theatrical work, and in his persona, which I think is interesting that you connect it not just to surrealism, but to Dada, a kind of a knowing madness, or a willful one. And I mean, that's a question that I think maybe comes across in the excerpt, is how willful was it in your view, but also how important is that it be seen as willful?
Well, the Dada said that the artist is someone who takes all the contradiction, who assimilate all the contradiction of their societies, right? That's their job. As far as Artaud is concerned, the theatre of cruelty was an experiment. To the experiment in a small space, which is a space of a theatre, an experiment with what society is as a whole, And the idea for them was that if they managed to create groups that are changed by what? Not by Artaud's cruelty, but by the sudden realization that they don't exist anymore, that they are just, living a life that is not worth living, a life where everyone is exchangeable, whose life and death really couldn't be of any importance to anyone. If the spectators were able to feel that, really what they were, not what they believe or made to believe that they were, then they would be saved in some way. And this little cell that they created, Bataille, Sacrifice, Artaud, Theatre, Cruelty, etc., were like they had the capacity to expand like the plague. Because the text on the plague is that a virus could cure as well as it could kill. But then, if you send a virus like in a computer, right, you're not in control of the virus. And the virus that they were working on was the same virus as fascism and Nazism, right? They all were fanatics. Deliberately, they chose to be fanatics because the society was becoming fanatized. Right, fanaticize, right? So they inoculated the disease in order to experiment with it. That's basically it. So they were illuminated in a sense that they really truly believed in their life that they were going to build something, that could regenerate society as a whole. But they were kind of washed away, and that's why their life and always went down badly. Right? It's not because that they were geniuses and all that. It's not the archetype of the, people can make fun of the archetype of the modernist hero, but they did their best to go as far as they could, which people won't do anymore, because where is the as far? Where can you go too far? It's impossible to go too far now, because our society is permeated with flows that never stop, that always changes, and something else is added to the code, and we live in a society where it is impossible to know what the society is about anymore. Artaud, among others, were an attempt to territorialize society, to give people tools to reclaim their life, right? Mm-hmm. And we know that now nothing can be reclaimed, not even the planet.
Well, I'll ask one more question and open it up, because one of the how to put it, there's a lot to talk about, but one thing would be to say that from Brecht's notion of the alienation effect or the estrangement effect to Artaud's excess of gesture, perhaps confronting thought, or thought as the confidence of meaning, or even with the case of someone like Beckett, who also adopts a kind of, in a way, sort of nihilism of sorts, or at least the stance of nihilism. They all, in a way, adopt a kind of comic quality, a comic grotesque, that in some ways does not prevail after World War II in the dialogue, and in some ways only kind of becomes possible to engage with in what we came to call postmodernism, where you could engage again with something grotesque, or as you put it, something that embraces the viral or embraces the ill. Whereas Artaud was very influenced by Nietzsche. Nietzsche said we were sick with history. Artaud, perhaps as you're saying, is saying that we were sick with society, which is something a lot of people have been talking about, or certain theorists have been talking about in the last 30 years. But you, Sylvère, come onto the scene in bringing a lot of this, writing to the English language in what we would call the postmodern moment, or a postmodern moment as it arrives in the States, in particular in New York, in your publishing through semiotext. But I guess the question I have is, that's one. I know you don't necessarily identify with that postmodernism frame or label. But label, which I totally understand. But if this book is talking about perhaps the idea of being ill with society as opposed to ill with history, as Nietzsche put it at that time, and you, in a way, brought so many of those voices, which were really off. You couldn't touch them in the post-war situation because of so many things that are implicated, like from anti-Semitism to insanity to the myth of the artist as crazy and all those kinds of things. How do you see that now, from when you studied semiotext and introduced all these theorists, to now 2015, where you're arguing, or at least saying, that the flow has overtaken everything, and even a voice like Artaud is perhaps hard to hear?
Well, it's hard because we're not ready for it. Since we're talking about the plague, the plague was a conference that Artaud gave at the Sorbonne. He's a psychiatrist. His family had given him over to a psychiatrist who specialized in geniuses, right? And Dr. Alendi. And Dr. Alendi invited Artaud to talk at the Sorbonne. Artaud at the Sorbonne. And Artaud started talking about the plague, and it's an incredible text, the theater and the plague. And towards the end of his talk, he started not just talking about the plague, but crawling between the spectators, a bit like living theater will do later on, right? And just, crawling, and people didn't know what to do. And they say, is it laughable, or is it horrible? This guy, is it crazy? And slowly they laughed uneasily, and then finally all the audience dissipated. And then Artaud just got up, dusted his jacket, and said, let's have a drink, He said, these people, they don't realize that they're already dead. Right, and the text, the first collection of essays that Artaud published was Art and Death, right, and one of them starts with Artaud imagining the spiral that it is to be dying, so that he gets you into a whole experience of death as an experience, because he identified from very beginning the fact that what was dead was death. People were deadened by the fact that they couldn't confront death anymore, which means that they couldn't confront life. And the theater of cruelty is expose people to the experience of death, so that they would be kind of reborn like humans and not just like machines, right? And that's the gamble, of Artaud. Bataille was the sacrifice. You sacrifice a person, but everyone identify not just to the person that is being sacrificed, but to the wound, which is not even human, so that they lose their head, they lose their consciousness. If they lose their consciousness, then the whole group is going to be united by a bond. They would create a real community. Right? This is exactly what they want. They're all dying to create a community. Simone Weil, when she goes to Germany in 1932, she hears young Nazis talking, and she said, if I wasn't resisting, I would become a Nazi, because the idea of community, she was so lonely, that she was ready to give herself up in anything that would be communal, but at the same time refusing it. Right, so the whole idea between the two world wars is that people were being individualized by the system to become exchangeable by the system. People had been territorialized and thrown into this urban environment that they didn't know, and that's no surprise that at the same time you have many people like Le Bon prophesizing about the masses and how you could manipulate the masses and lead the masses, which Hitler read. Why? Because people stopped being rooted somewhere. The title of the last book by Simone Weil is The Need for Roots. But who wants roots? Also the Nazis. Well, not the Nazis, the German population, or the French, the soil, the patriotism, etc. All these are like ambivalent, emotions, but very contagious. And again, what I call the high modernists is people who are ready to go all the way into experimenting in a hope that they could do something before the Holocaust and before all the massacres are going to happen. It's not going to be 20,000 million, it's going to be 50 million people. And even bio-allies. I remember as a child seeing above me an English pilot that was bombing. It was like I could see his face. It was our allies. Right? But the war doesn't know any camp. The war is here to stay, and that's what we see now. The war machine has been churning out constantly since the First World War. It's a continuous technological innovation that we are dumped on, and we have been trying to. We are being educated for the Third or Fourth or Fifth World War. We are now all, ready to wage an electronic war. We are being trained for that. We are the soldiers. There is no more difference between peace and war, and we are becoming the soldiers of the capitalist system. The techno-capitalism is on, and we don't know what to do because it's destroying the whole environment too.
So. Is this on? Yeah. So, just to turn it over to the audience, but maybe last question, because I mean that's a big subject you just brought up. But the emphasis on affect and emotion and the resonance of emotion, and in some ways the fear of being emotional, especially at a time, as you put it in your introduction, where we're expected to trade, or even at a younger age you learn to trade on one's persona, one's name, or even the projection of one's imagined name or persona. It's becoming part of capitalism, and closer and closer to individuals. If we're in that moment and we're looking for resistance, is that why, or if not resistance, something that interrupts it, is that why you chose to sort of take up Artaud again at the moment? Is because of that sort of salvo of, in a sense, affective intelligence?
You were talking about nihilism, but there's two kinds of nihilism. One is active and one is reactive. Nietzsche actively sought the destruction of values because the values we inherited were not holding anymore. But he was still hoping to recreate values. That was a Superman, the re-evaluation of values. Unfortunately, in the system we used to have use values and exchange values, right? And exchange values were turning things into a commodity, and use values was a kind of material aspect of objects that are not yet being exchanged, right? Now use values that triumphed all the way. We are in a realm of exchangeability where there is no more use values. Everything that we acquire is not a use value, it's like an exchange value, right? So in a sense, Marx anticipated that. He said capitalism was going to go and become more and more abstract, right? And it's exactly what you're experiencing now. That's why Artaud is so important as a reminder. But we cannot, we cannot connect to Artaud's experience if we have become like this kind of individual who believe that they are immortal. Artaud's experience is death, right? He's not. He's a prophet of death, right? He wanted people to experience death because he was aware that people were not becoming human anymore, right?
Isn't it important to say that he wanted to, as with Brecht, as with many other people, he wanted people to experience the rehearsal of death so that they didn't have to perpetrate death?
Right. But consciousness is not enough. That's why they talk about shock just like that for different reasons. Dada wanted to shock the bourgeois. Artaud wanted to electroshock the population, right? And he was given the electroshock in return.
At least 50 times.
Poetic justice, but he quoted it. All his life. Same with Simone Weil and Breton and Bataille. There are people who really realize that they had no life and they could only have a life if they let themselves carried away by all these affects that they themselves couldn't experience anymore. That's an important point, right? They were shell-shocked, but the whole culture is shell-shocked. That's why experiencing death is so important. Like 20 years ago, they asked François Mitterrand, the president of France, if he could imagine his death. And François Mitterrand said, no. We are incapable of identifying with it, which means that we don't have a life. For Artaud, this is the cut-off point. Death is the ultimate shock. But you don't have to wait until the last moment to be shocked into living a life that's worth living, right? And that's what they wanted.
On that note, I'm going to see if there are any questions from the audience. And I have one of the mics that can be used. But are there two mics? Is there over there?
I'm curious as to know more about how Artaud is regarded in France. I feel like in this country he's often somebody you mention, depending on what your major is in college, he's somebody you mention in between Dada and Futurists. And if you're a theater major, maybe it's an excuse to do some really fucked up performance art during the Artaud unit. But I'd like to know more about whether he's considered underground, above ground, cult status, or if he really is considered a thinker in France?
In France. Well, in France, it's episodic. I mean, French is pretty sick these days. They would need some of the high modernists to kind of jolt them into a realization of something that keep escaping them. Artaud is very big in every single Christian Catholic country. He's big in Mexico, he's big in Italy, he's big in France, countries where religions have lost a lot of their influence and importance, but they're still, born with it, right? And Artaud is taken very seriously, and by this culture in Europe. But in the States, it's different. In the States, Artaud is a specialty of people who do theater, right? But we don't realize that Artaud realized something, and I wanted to evoke that. His book, The Theater Needs Double, was published exactly as Artaud was going to Ireland. And no one knew about Artaud. The book fell into a black hole. The war was coming, and if not Artaud's book was totally forgotten. It's only in the 60s that Allen Ginsberg, John Cage rediscovered Artaud, right? And in France, it was the same. It was in the 60s that Artaud's book suddenly came out. Brecht was that before. The two, not the two twin cities, but the two twin dramaturge, Artaud and Brecht. Of the two, Brecht had a whole, constituency behind, but Artaud was alone, and he had to be rediscovered by people who worked separately, like that. Now, what I wanted to say something about the film. While I was making the film, I suddenly realized that something was happening. That Artaud is not someone who writes theories and then experience them separately. See, Artaud, life, death, it just one and the same thing. It was something every day you have to share all that, right? And you have to be aware of it, right? So what happened that in a state of complete emergency, he chose to train himself as an actor, to use this training as an actor, not to help himself, but to take him out of this predicament. What I don't show here is that Artaud was in love with a woman, which sounds very unlikely. Even more, Artaud, who is, let's say, if not impotent, at least incapable of having sex, was trying to get married to this woman. And of course, when the parents saw Artaud perform in Brussels, they realized who he was, and they immediately broke down the marriage. And that was the drop that tipped the balance. Artaud went through a detox, and we talked about that in the complete version. He went, and for the first time in his life, with the help of his fiancée, he got detoxed. But the junk was a protection against madness. Because he had this incredible nervous, physical, kind of symptom. He stumbled, and he had his whole body was a mess. That's why, as an actor, he was so awkward and rigid and all that, because he was constantly had to reinvent the next step when he walked, right? So Artaud realized that his training of actor is that you create a double of yourself. Right? You have one, the person itself, and then you have the double that the actor builds besides himself. In other words, if emotions come from the outside, whenever an actor has an emotion, instead of experiencing it, he would just put it in the double, so that when he would need this emotion, he would just be able to mobilize it to play it on the stage, right? So the creation of a double, it was a very dangerous creation because, as we know through the German Romantics, the shadow sometimes can follow you and destroy you. You know, double is not there for you. It's like a sorcerer. You know,
don't you think? I mean, what's interesting is also you mentioned Freud and the death drive and the instinct, which is written directly in response to war.
To our fellow world, yeah.
Lacan writes the idea of the paranoid self, the self that we need to project into the future in order to be sane, but also the self that we project into the future and imagine their behavior as being something we can never attain, that becomes a anticipatory shadow, not the shadow behind you, but in front of you. And these are ideas that are written at this really in between the wars.
Yes.
Which I think is very important to say, that being beside oneself, or the double, the notion of the double, which if you take away Artaud's biography and truly his symptom, which is one of being mentally ill and a lot of other things, physically ill, an addict, but the notion of the double, being beside oneself, if you look at it in terms of those two, there's many other examples. You could say it's part of, if not a theoretical response, certainly a sociological response in writing that would be in keeping with, in a sense, Freud and Lacan. Different, but in dialogue.
Yeah, well, Artaud had some problems with Lacan. You know, in his text on Van Gogh, he says there is this kind of a perverse psychiatrist, Dr. L, you know, who like is a
Lacan, no?
Well,
or
I'm the one who revealed it because he's a publisher, knew it directly from Artaud, but Artaud asked her never to divulgate it. And when I talked to the publisher, Paul Thévenin, she didn't know that she didn't want to be interviewed, you know, and she didn't want to be recorded. So I had to hide the tape recorder. I know, you know, God will forgive me. But she said, you know, that she revealed that the famous Dr. L was not Dr. La Trémolière, who was dying to be the Dr. L, and spent all his life like resenting Artaud for it. But Dr. L was Lacan. I have to remind you also that Artaud was moved from Sotteville-les-Rouen to Sainte-Anne in Paris, which is like a switchboard for mental patients. They are like examined and then sent to whoever institution is adequate for them. So Artaud stayed there for like 6 months, and André Breton, very close to André Breton, but André Breton never wanted to see him, right? Because he couldn't take, like Freud. Breton and Freud didn't like psychotics. Right? They love neurotics, which is like anyone, but but not psychotics, right? And Lacan was specialist in what I would call fast diagnosis. You know, he was, and that's something that he maintained after the war, right? That he made evaluation in 5 minutes, and he gave the diagnosis, and he examined Artaud for 5 minutes, and when he got out, he said, "This man will never write again. His delirium is fixed." Right? Artaud wrote 20 books after that.
Yeah.
Right?
Question here. We take one more or two more or one more after yours, Nick.
This psychosis, this schizophrenia, that is so much of what the book is about. What is your experience? I mean, you brought it out. You've had the schizoculture. Sort of, it's been a study of yours, I guess, throughout your life. I want to tie it together with the idea of bringing the desire for the theoretical to have value, to really have some practical value. What is the practical value of psychosis? Is it possible to ourselves have that experience, whether it's on a peak experience or an everyday experience, to sort of can we sort of be inoculated from perhaps the anti-socialization part of it, and is there a practical value so we can kind of live in that insight of the connectedness?
Well, if we were living on a level with what is happening right now in the world and in our world, then you could be inoculated very simply. In other words, I mean, my own experience and maybe why I connected to it is that I was born dead, right? I mean, I was born dead by the war. It took me 50 years to recover from it, right? So no wonder death has not been something that I'm afraid of. It's something I was born with. And I think everyone who gets born, is basically invents death. But we shy away from it. We live in a society where we don't want to know what's going to happen. Even the most likely one, no one can escape death so far. So what Artaud wanted is people just to be aware of the fact that being born is to be dying, and take it in an active way, not nihilistic and not pessimistic, but the fact that we all have a life and we can either waste it, waiting for the next gadget, or we can maybe do something a bit more crucial, and that's the only chance we have. We're never going to be given another life. So who cares? Why not take a risk? Why not try to do something that would be worth living? And that's basically what the example is, right? And it's not postmodern for that, right? Okay. But what I wanted to draw attention, because I didn't quite finish about it, what I realized while making a film is that Artaud, at the time his book was about to be published, he was his first reader. Right? In other words, he realized that he could use his training as an actor and create a double for himself, right? That he could train himself to become even more delirious than he was, to use delirium as a way as a cure. And that's what we did, and that's what I wanted to document in this film, because no one has paid attention to this very kind of downer of a period of Artaud. Everyone wants to see the glory of Artaud, but what happened there is very important. He's becoming mad, and the film is about what it is to become mad, what it is to become delirious, and that connects also to theory. To answer your question, in Deleuze and Guattari, they paint capitalism as a code between two extremes, the extreme of schizophrenia and the extreme of paranoia. But they are not Lacanians, and they don't think that one is exclusive of the other. Artaud is schizophrenic. He doesn't know who he is. He loses his identity, etc. But at the beginning of the film, what we see is Artaud trying deliberately to lose his name, to become no one, and to let all these emotions, he gives them a name. I'm the betrayed, the tortured man. I am the abstract man. It's like he creates effigies for the affect, for the emotion that he mobilized and that he internalized, coming from the outside, right? And so contrary to what is usually thought about this period of Artaud, where people it's a period of collapse. It couldn't be worse. In fact, it's the contrary. Artaud deliberately wanted to become mad as a way of curing, regaining his strength. He was beaten up right and left. He was a genius, but he failed as an actor. He failed in a silent film. He failed in the theater. So when he went to Mexico, it was like going for broke, right? And okay, he discovered tarumaras, but everything else was a catastrophe. And he came back a junkie as usual, right? So for him, delirious became something that he was a prey of, but he willingly wanted to be mad because that was regaining his strength. And what you see in the film is not someone who's like to be pitied. He's on top of his shape, just like La Trémolière. La Trémolière loved to argue with things with me, right? Because there were a level, total level of energy, of the energy. And that's what Artaud said. He was totally beaten up by society, and he said, okay, I'm left alone, but I'm going by myself to become mad in order to become strong. And he became delirious as a sign of strength. If he hadn't been stopped by the police in Dublin and moved around and put in jail and put in a straitjacket in a boat, he wouldn't have been becoming mad. His delirious was positive. See? And that's what I was trying to say. And again, to show there was a reference, of course, a reference in my mind to Deleuze and Guattari, because I'm a Deleuze-Guattarian and have been for 40 years, right? And it's very cryptic the way they describe, the back and forth between, or the oscillation between the two. It's not like, so within schizophrenia you have like some whiffs of paranoia that comes in, so that Artaud is no one, but suddenly he's going to be all the names of history. He's going to be Paolo Uccello, he's going to be Van Gogh, he's going to be Gérard de Nerval, he's going to be Ramses II, right? He can be anything because he is nothing. Delirium is a liberation from repression. To be normal is to be guilty. Paying your debt to everyone, to your family, to society, etc., and financially too. You're never free. In his delirium that I showed of Artaud going up and down and all that, he shit on everyone. What does it mean? It means that he's beyond good and evil. He's beyond morality. He's at a level of emotion, raw emotion, horrible emotions, horrible energy toward this woman. But he had to go through that. He has to go through this delirium, because while he's doing that, he becomes a sorcerer. He acquires the power of a sorcerer. He can change the world, right? And that's what he does. And when he does that, when he writes his spell, suddenly he's getting into this gig, this jig. He can do anything now because he had graduated into become a sorcerer. In other words, to draw energy for himself. It was a rescue. He came to his own rescue. He gambled his life, but he was about to succeed, and then he was like washed away, right?
So, thank you. I think we'll continue the conversation in Delirium out in front because the book's available, and I know Sylvère will stick around if you want to talk to him and ask any questions. Thank you, Sylvère.
Please do.